And Julian, very similar question to you. What is kind of your interpretation? What have you seen from trade data in the last 2 years?
Well, I thought actually I'd start with something that I think we can almost all agree on, which is that if you increase barriers to trade, there will be less trade done. So I think it'd be very surprising if Brexit, at least to begin with, hadn't initially had some negative impact on the amount of trade that we do. Independently of the data, you can of course pick that up from talking to almost any business or looking at any business survey. They have found trade with the EU more difficult, and some smaller firms have actually stopped doing it altogether. So I think there is clearly going to be some negative impact on trade from what we've seen so far. I think we could also all agree that that's a bad thing. So it would be very odd for any free market economist to argue that an increase in trade barriers is anything other than bad for growth and bad for prosperity. And in my view, that applies both to exports and also to imports. So that the fact that we're importing less is potentially bad for the economy as well. So I think those are the broad points of agreement, at least amongst what I call sensible economists on all sides of the debate. But there would probably be three areas where I would disagree with the consensus, if you like. One is about the strength of the evidence of a big effect on trade. I mean, Emily's already touched on some of the uncertainties here, the impact of COVID. I'd add the energy crisis to that as well. There are still question marks about the quality of the data. I acknowledge that the Bank of England has tried to adjust for that and suggest the numbers are actually worse rather than better, but that is uncertain. If you look below the headlines, there are a number of things that are still puzzles. One of these Emily's already mentioned, which is that our trade with the rest of the world seems to have been hit just as much as our trade with the EU, which suggests there might be something else going on apart from Brexit. It's also worth noting that our imports from the EU seem to have been hit to a similar degree as our exports to the EU. Which doesn't necessarily make sense because at this stage the UK hasn't imposed the full import barriers that it's planning to do. And there might be some other potential factors as well. So, for example, sectoral differences. The sorts of things that we export might be things that have been hit particularly hard by COVID or by external factors, so the problems in the auto sector because of the shortages of semiconductors being a good example of that. So I'm not convinced that the evidence of a big hit to trade is actually that strong. My second point is about how permanent that hit is going to be. The sort of consensus is that it's only going to get worse, and admittedly it might do if the UK presses ahead with the new barriers to imports from the EU, that it's still promising. But there is some signs that exports and imports are recovering a bit, which sort of makes sense as businesses become used to the new arrangements. There's scope for small improvements in the trade and cooperation agreement, so we could get a better trade deal in future than we've got now. Technological advances as well, making it easier to deal with the paperwork. So there are some ways in which the initial costs of Brexit in terms of the hit to trade with the EU could diminish over time rather than increase. And then the final point is just about the big picture macroeconomics of this. And in particular, you might be aware that the Office for Budget Responsibility has suggested that the level of productivity in the UK, so that's sort of GDP per person, might end up 4% lower than it would otherwise have been. And that is primarily as a result of some strong assumptions they're making about the hit to the trade intensity of the UK, but also the knock-on effect of that on productivity. And I think both of those parts of the chain are questionable, in particular the impact on productivity, because the reality is that the UK will remain a relatively open economy. And there are some potential ways in which there could be offsetting boosts to productivity for the other aspects of Brexit. It isn't just about trade. There are other things that are going on as well. So I agree with the consensus insofar as, yes, it's inevitable if you raise trade barriers, there will be less trade. But I don't think the effect is that might be attributed purely to Brexit is as big as people suggest. I think some of it will be temporary. And also the knock-on effects on the economy, the wider economy, may not be as substantial as some people suggest either.